Why was everyone in that dark screening room ignoring her trembling hands? Because grief wasn't supposed to look like this. It wasn't supposed to take notes. February 14th, 1943. United Aircraft Corporation, Hartford, Connecticut. A 16 projector hummed in the corner, its light flickering against the pale faces of engineers and analysts. But only one person wasn't blinking: Senior Fuel Systems Engineer. On the screen, frame 247 froze, a single 20 cannon round tearing through a B-17's fuel tank. Frame 251, an expanding bloom of light. By frame 264, the entire aircraft was on fire, wings folding upward, 9 men gone in less than 3 seconds. The others in the room leaned back, murmuring about statistics and enemy action, but didn't hear them, because she knew the man in the co-pilot seat. Her brother, David. And she had just watched him die again. The official report called it unavoidable. Enemy cannon fire, no equipment failure. But saw something else in those 17 frames, a solvable problem that no one wanted to believe could be solved. The Army Air Forces called it fate. She called it a design flaw. That night, when most of the factory had gone dark, her house lights burned bright. Her husband, Robert, found her in the garage, surrounded by open fuel cell manuals, rubber compounds, diagrams of wing sections. She didn't cry. She was calculating. Because that's what grief does to some people. It doesn't break them. It focuses them. Robert stood quietly in the doorway. He knew that look, the same one she'd worn during every impossible project, every moment when someone told her it couldn't be done. Only this time, the cost of failure wasn't a missed deadline. It was 9 who'd never come home. And so she began. For 3 weeks, lived inside reels of combat footage, frame by frame, note by note. She requisitioned additional film from Wright Field in Ohio, interviewed representatives stationed in England, traded letters with chemists working on rubber compounds. Every detail, every hit, every fire, she logged it all. What the data revealed was horrifying. Self-sealing fuel tanks, the pride of American engineering, had saved dozens of aircraft from rifle-caliber hits. But against 20 cannon shells, they were useless. The Luftwaffe's new fighters, 190s and 109s, carried high-explosive rounds that didn't just pierce metal, they shredded it. One shell could rupture the tank walls, ignite vapor, and turn a bomber into a crematorium at 25,000 feet. Stared at the math until it blurred. A B-17 carried 1,730 gallons of fuel in 9 tanks, most of them sitting right where German fighters aimed first, the inner wings. One lucky hit and nothing left but fire. The engineers around her didn't want to hear it. They said, "It's war, there's only so much we can do." But she had stopped believing in so much. Her brother had burned to death because someone once said that exact phrase. So she began to design the impossible. The problem wasn't courage. The problem was weight. Every pound added to a bomber reduced its altitude, its range, its chance to survive, and was about to add 847 of them. Her idea went against everything they'd been taught, but war doesn't care about textbooks. She proposed a 3-layer barrier system, an outer rubber that swelled even under explosive shock, a middle layer of foam baffles to stop sloshing fuel from feeding a fire, an inner vulcanized layer strong enough to seal wounds that no ordinary tank could survive. She added strategic armor, not around the whole tank, but around the 12 points that mattered most. Then she added fire suppression lines, bottles of CO2 that would flood the wing cavity within seconds of ignition. All of it, the armor, the barriers, the suppression, came to 847 pounds. The penalty was altitude, but the trade was life. She wrote her proposal like a soldier writing her last letter home, precise, careful, urgent. And when she sent it to the Army Air Forces, Material Command on March 8, 1943, she waited. The rejection arrived 4 weeks later. Typed in neat, confident language, signed by Colonel Harrison. Weight penalty unacceptable. Existing self-sealing technology adequate for operational requirements. Proposed system would reduce operational sealing by 1,200 feet. Performance degradation not acceptable. Read it 3 times. Her hands didn't shake, her jaw did. Men were dying every week, but the Army was more afraid of losing altitude on paper than losing lives in the sky. They had tested for rifle fire in peacetime. They hadn't updated their math for cannon shells in war. She stared at the letter until she could no longer see words, just the space where her brother's name should been. Then she folded it neatly, placed it in her desk, and whispered, "Fine, we'll do it my way." Through her position at United Aircraft, had connections, field officers, test pilots, even a few generals who'd seen combat. One name surfaced again and again, Brigadier General Frank. He'd commanded bomb groups over Germany. He'd watched men burn alive through his binoculars. And most importantly, he hated bureaucracy. Knew she'd get one shot, so she prepared everything. A briefcase with her blueprints. A scale model of a B-17 wing section. A short reel of film, the one with her brother's final moments. On April 20th, she boarded the train to Washington, D.C. The ride took 6 hours. The memories took all night. The next morning, in a Pentagon conference room smelling of cigarette smoke and coffee, Frank walked in, younger than she expected, eyes tired but sharp. He didn't waste time. "Let's hear it," he said. Presented everything, the data, the failures, the theory. He interrupted only once. "You're telling me this system would save your brother?" Her heart jumped. She hadn't mentioned David, but had done his homework. She looked him straight in the eye. "It would save crews like my brother," she said quietly. "That's what matters." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the faint hiss of the projector reel. Then stood, crossed his arms, and said, "You know they'll never approve this through official channels." "I know," she said. "But you can." He smiled just slightly. "I might know someone crazy enough to try." 3 weeks later, she received a letter, unofficial, unsigned, written in the clipped tone of quiet rebellion. Authorization to test her system with the 351st Bomb Group, stationed at Air Base, England. No public announcement, no press release. Just a single line. Provide reasonable support for evaluation of operational requirements. Didn't tell Robert goodbye with words. She told him with her eyes, with her hands, with the weight of a promise she couldn't put into sentences. Then she boarded a Liberty ship bound for Liverpool, 14 days across an Atlantic thick with submarines and fog. Twice the convoy changed course in the night. Once, the alarm sirens went off, false alarm, but she didn't sleep again after that. In her cabin, she went over installation procedures by flashlight. 2 aircraft for full modification. 1 for partial. 40 hours of work each. No second chances. By the time the English coast appeared, her notes were smudged with fingerprints and coffee stains. Air Base looked almost peaceful from a distance, green hills, stone walls, sheep scattered in the fields. But up close, war had its own smell. Hot oil, hydraulic fluid, sweat, fear. Colonel James Hastings, commander of the 351st, met her in a drafty Quonset hut that rattled in the wind. He looked her over like a man, still deciding whether to salute or sigh. "General speaks highly of you," he said, though his letter didn't exactly explain what this project involves. Spread her blueprints across his desk. This system will keep your men alive." When she mentioned the 847-pound weight penalty, Hastings frowned. "My crews already struggle to hit ceiling with full bomb loads," he said. "You want me to make their planes heavier?" "I want you to make them survivable," she replied. He said nothing. So she asked softly, "How many bombers have you lost to fuel fires in the last 3 months?" 14 aircraft, he said. 123 men. "Then we have nothing left to lose." Hastings leaned back, staring at her, then exhaled. "You'll need to convince my pilots. I won't order anyone to fly experimental modifications. You want test crews. You tell them why." That night in a cold wooden theater that smelled of oil and damp wood, 60 pilots gathered, faces lined with exhaustion, youth aged by survival. Walked to the front, no notes in hand. They expected a presentation. What they got was the truth. "My name is," she began. "I designed fuel systems for these bombers you fly. 3 months ago I watched one of them explode. My brother was in the co-pilot seat." The room went silent. "I'm not here with promises. I'm here with a chance, one that weighs 847 pounds. That's the difference between ceiling altitude and coming home." A hand rose in the third row. "What happens if your system fails?" "Then you die the same way you do now," she said. "But if it works, you live, and I need proof in combat." Silence stretched until a young captain stood. His voice was quiet, steady. "I'll fly it," he said. "Lost my co-pilot last month. If this keeps that from happening again, I'll take the weight." His name was Captain Robert, call sign Bobby. He commanded a B-17, nicknamed Lady Liberty. By the time the meeting ended, 5 more hands had joined his. Over the next 2 weeks, the hangars glowed through the night. Mechanics worked by lamplight, hands blackened with oil and sealant. Doctor, a chemist from, arrived to supervise the curing of the new rubber layers. Her voice cut through the hangar noise like a command. 16 hours at ambient temperature, not 15, not 17. You rush this, you kill them. Crew Chief Henry nodded. He'd been maintaining planes since before the war. He didn't believe in miracles, but he believed in craftsmanship. When he asked how long the tanks would hold if hit again, said, "Long enough for them to come home." Captain Bobby visited every night, running his hand along the new armor plates like a man memorizing the feel of survival. His flight engineer, Sergeant Frank Marco, examined the new fire suppression switches in the cockpit. 2 minutes instead of 30 seconds, he asked. Nodded. He smiled grimly. In combat, 2 minutes is forever. By June 21st, Lady Liberty was ready. Ground tests passed, systems worked. Weight increase, 847 pounds exactly. The first combat test was set for June 24th, a raid on Bremen. 36 bombers, one of them experimental. As engines roared to life at dawn, stood on the control tower, watching Lady Liberty climb into the cold morning sky. Her hand gripped the railing so tightly, her knuckles turned white. She had done everything she could. Now she could only wait. The engine started just after dawn, 4 Wright Cyclones coughing to life beneath a gray English sky. The ground trembled. Metal groaned. And in that vibration, felt something she hadn't in months: hope. Lady Liberty rolled toward the main runway, her polished wings catching the first weak light of morning. 36 B-17s lined up across steel planking, each a fortress of rivets and nerves. At 7:12, the first bomber lifted off. At 7:31, Lady Liberty followed, heavy, defiant, and carrying within her 847 pounds of one woman's impossible dream. From the tower, watched the formation climb east, engines thundering across hills. The vapor trails stretched thin against the pale blue sky, vanishing toward the horizon, toward Bremen. She stood there long after the roar faded, hands still on the rail, whispering to herself. Come back, just come back. At 24,000 feet, the world was nothing but silver light and thin air. Inside Lady Liberty, Captain Robert Bobby ran through his final checks, voice steady over the intercom. Fuel transfer system. Checked and operating, answered Sergeant Marco from the top turret. Fire suppression. Standard system armed, wing tank suppression safe and ready. They flew as part of the High Squadron, 3rd Aircraft, 2nd Element. Bremen was 6 hours away. 6 hours of flak, fighters, and fate. Lieutenant Michael, the co-pilot, tapped the altimeter, holding steady at 24,000. Bobby nodded, eyes fixed ahead. Below them, the clouds stretched like endless snow. Above, the sky deepened into a color only pilots ever truly saw, a hard, perfect blue. Over the North Sea, the bombers closed formation, overlapping wings like shields. The radio crackled within coordinates. Every man aboard knew the odds. 71% of bomber crews would be killed, wounded, or captured before completing their 25 missions. But no one said it aloud. Approaching Dutch coast, the navigator reported. The clock read 9:12. Then came the first black bursts, flak blooming in the distance like evil flowers. Seconds later, the concussions hit. Thump, thump, thump. The air shook. Shrapnel rang off the fuselage, metallic hail on a coffin lid. Bobby gritted his teeth, holding formation. Bombers didn't dodge, not during the run. They stayed in line, steady as death. Marco's voice came over the intercom, calm but tight. Flak's walking closer, Cap. Copy that, Bobby said. Keep your eyes open. Through the nose, Lieutenant James, the navigator, spotted Bremen's industrial sprawl shimmering in the haze, the submarine yards along the Weser River. And then came the fighters. Bandits 12 o'clock high. FW-190s, sharp-winged gray, deadly. They dove from the sun, cannons flashing. Every tracer streaked like fire across heaven. The bomber formation lit up, 50-caliber guns thundering from every window, turret, and hatch. Marco swung his top turret around and fired short bursts, chasing the diving shapes. In the waist positions, Sergeant Vernon Hayes and his partner raked the air with their guns, their world nothing but smoke, cold, and the rhythm of recoil. The first pass missed Lady Liberty. The second didn't. A heavy impact slammed through the left wing, not an explosion, just a single, brutal hit that made the whole airframe groan. Bobby's stomach dropped. He knew that sound. Marco. Number 2 fuel tank hit, came the reply. I see vapor streaming, no fire yet, temperature holding steady. Bobby's jaw clenched. He'd watched enough bombers vanish in sheets of flame to know what was supposed to happen next. In 15 seconds, that wing should ignite. In 30, it should tear free. But not this time. Not if system worked. Activate wing suppression, Bobby ordered. There was a pause. Then a hiss. CO2 flooded the left wing compartment. Cold, white, invisible salvation. Vapor stream slowing, Marco said. Temperature holding, no fire. Bobby looked at, neither spoke. They just listened, waiting for the sirens, the rising heat, the scream of metal. It never came. Lady Liberty kept flying. On the intercom called, target ahead, beginning bomb run. At 26,000 feet, they leveled out. Bomb bay doors opened. Wind howled through the fuselage. Steady. Steady. Bombs away. The aircraft lurched upward as 6,000 pounds of explosives fell free. Through the nose, watched the bombs descend in slow, eerie silence, then bloom into orange across Bremen's docks. Close bay doors, Bobby commanded. As the steel panels shut, Another formation to their right took a direct hit, a fireball where a bomber used to be. Flaming debris tumbled past them, spinning through the thin air. The crew went quiet. They'd learned long ago not to say the names of those who fell. Turning left off target, said. Bobby banked gently. The plane shuddered, but the wing held. Another wave of fighters attacked during the withdrawal. 2 raked the right wing, shredding the aileron and punching holes through the cowling of engine 4. The bomber listed, Bobby corrected. His forearms ached from gripping the yoke. Control cables damaged, Marco called. Keep her level, Bobby said through his teeth. The engine coughed, sputtered, then caught again, wounded but alive. They were still flying. Stood on the control tower 6 hours later, binoculars pressed to her face, scanning the horizon. A formation appeared, black dots emerging from the haze over the channel. 36 had gone out. She began to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 33. Her heart thudded painfully. 3 missing. But then near the rear of the formation, she spotted it, a bomber with a drooping right wing, flying low but steady. Lady Liberty. The tower erupted in cheers as the landing gear came down. The bomber touched hard, tires screaming against the steel planking, sparks flashing from the brakes. It wobbled, slowed, then rolled to a stop. Didn't wait for clearance. She ran. When she reached the air was thick with heat and smoke. Crew Chief Henry was already inspecting the damage, counting bullet holes. 17. He climbed onto the left wing, opened the access panel and froze. The aluminum skin was torn open, 3 inches wide. But inside, no fire damage, no charred remains. The inner rubber layer had sealed the rupture. The foam baffles had absorbed the blast. The system had held. He turned to the approaching figure, breathless, covered in grit. You did it, he said simply. Damn it, you actually did it. Captain Bobby climbed down from the cockpit, exhausted but grinning. Your fuel tank trick, he said, voice rough from oxygen and fear, just saved 10 men. Looked at the hole, at the ugly, twisted reminder of what could been. Her hands shook, and for the first time in months she let them. That night she sat alone in her quarters, the hum of generators outside her window. She replayed every second of the day, the hit, the hiss, the silence that followed. For the first time since her brother's death, the silence didn't feel empty. But she also knew this was only the beginning. One plane wasn't proof. Not yet. Over the next 6 weeks, Lady Liberty and 2 other modified bombers flew 17 missions. They were hit on 11. Fuel tanks were pierced by cannon shells, by shrapnel, by luck, and every time they came home. Not one fire. Not one lost crew. The numbers spoke for themselves. In that same period, 9 other bombers from the 351st burned and fell. 9 aircraft. 90 men. Recorded every incident in precise handwriting, her reports growing thicker, her evidence undeniable. But when she sent it back to Wright Field for review, the reply came from the same office, the same man. Colonel, test sample too small. Field conditions too variable. Weight penalty remains unacceptable. She set the paper down, jaw trembling with anger. Men were dying, and he was still counting pounds. Colonel Hastings read the letter beside her and swore under his breath. He can't admit he was wrong. Approving this now means admitting his first rejection killed people. Stared out the window. Rain streaked down the glass. No, she said, we're done waiting for permission. Hastings picked up the phone. He called General Frank. Didn't ask for reports. He didn't ask for paperwork. He just said, I'm coming to see it myself. He arrived 3 days later with Major General May, commander of the 3rd Bomb Division, a man known for having excuses. They spent 4 hours in the hangar, examining the battle-damaged fuel tanks stacked like coffins along the wall. May ran his hand over the torn aluminum, tracing the smooth, sealed rubber beneath. "The weight reduces ceiling by 1,000 feet, he said finally. Then he looked at, "But fuel fires reduce ceiling to ground level." He smiled grimly. "This is a good trade." Nodded. "Material Command will fight it." "Let them," May said. "I'm authorizing it." And just like that, after months of resistance, the impossible became policy. Every bomber in the 3rd Division would be modified. Implementation was chaos. 12 groups, 400 aircraft. Each modification required 40 hours of labor, rubber compounds from, armor plate from steel mills already running 24-hour shifts. Doctor returned to Akron to supervise scaling production. She was relentless, the kind of relentless that only comes from knowing what failure costs. When a supervisor suggested cutting corners to meet deadlines, she snapped. The difference between acceptable and perfect is dead. At trained crews herself, teaching them how to install barrier systems in freezing hangars, under leaking tarps, with nothing but lamps and determination. She worked 18-hour days, covered in oil, her voice hoarse but steady. Because now she had proof that her work mattered. By November 1943, 78 bombers were modified. And in every mission since, the results were the same. When hit, they survived. The turning point came on November 29th. 2 groups went to Bremen. One with the new system, one without. The unmodified bombers' 18 aircraft faced heavy fighters. 7 were lost, 5 to fire. The modified bombers' 12 aircraft faced the same sky. 4 were hit. All came home. That was the day Colonel stopped writing rejection letters. Didn't celebrate. She just stood outside the hangar, breathing in the cold air, watching crews prepare for another mission. Because the work wasn't about being right. It was about the men climbing those ladders, the ones checking their fuel lines, the ones who didn't know that their survival hung on a war fought in conference rooms and blueprints. That night, walked alone to the edge of the runway. The wind smelled of oil and smoke, of home and war all at once. She looked up at the stars, the same stars her brother had seen on his last flight. "Your death wasn't meaningless," she whispered. "Not anymore." And in that quiet darkness, she realized something she hadn't before. The hardest battles aren't fought in the air. They're fought in silence, against the voices that say it can't be done. But sometimes silence fights back. And when it does, it saves lives. It was February 1944, and the war had entered a new kind of madness. They called it Big Week, Operation Argument, when the 8th Air Force sent everything it had against Germany's aircraft factories. 5 days, thousands of bombers, and losses so high that even victory tasted like ash. Hadn't planned to fly. She was an engineer, not aircrew. But after 8 months of fighting bureaucracy and surviving doubt, she needed to see, really see, what her work meant in the sky. So when General asked for a volunteer technical observer to accompany the 379th Bomb Group on a high-risk mission over, she didn't hesitate. Her hands shook as she signed the release form. Her colleagues called it reckless. Her husband called it unnecessary. But she only said one thing. "I designed this system for men who risk their lives every day. The least I can do is share the risk once." The morning of February 22, 1944, was brutally cold. A thin frost glazed the runways, and the horizon burned orange under a winter sun that offered no warmth. Crews moved like shadows, checking bombs, fueling engines, loading ammunition. Each man quiet in his ritual, each knowing it could be his last. Stood beside the B-17, she'd be flying in heaven sent, tail number 23,814. Her breath fogged in the air as she traced the bullet holes patched from previous missions. It wasn't fear that she felt. It was reverence. The flight engineer, Captain Samuel Bridgewater, met her at the ladder. "You sure about this, ma'am?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "You're trusting my design to save your life. Seems fair I should trust you to fly it." He laughed softly. "Fair enough." Inside, the cold was bone-deep. Frost clung to metal surfaces, and every breath turned to white mist. Settled into the radio operator's station, a cramped corner lined with wires, dials, and the soft hum of equipment. Through the fuselage wall, she could feel the vibration of the engine starting one by one, that slow, powerful rhythm that felt like the heart of the world. When they rolled down the runway, her pulse matched the roar. As the wheels left the ground, she realized she'd crossed an invisible line from observer to participant. At 25,000 feet, the air was thinner than glass. Below them, the world was nothing but clouds and war. The intercom buzzed constantly, voices clipped, calm, rehearsed. Took notes in her journal, even as her fingers stiffened from the cold. Pressure readings, fuel flow, tank temperature. She didn't notice at first when the first black puffs appeared ahead, not clouds, but flak bursts. The sound reached them a second later, deep, concussive thumps that rattled the ribs of the aircraft. Bridgewater's voice cut through. "Flak 12 o'clock, Titan formation." Looked through the side window. An endless field of black blooms, each one reaching for them. Then came the fighters. Bandits 11 o'clock high. FW-190s again, sleek, deadly, too fast to look real. They dived through the formation in coordinated pairs, firing 20 cannons that traced orange lines of fire across the sky. The first wave tore through the lead group. Saw a bomber ahead of them take a direct hit, its right wing folding upward before the entire plane disappeared into a fireball. No parachutes. Her heart hammered so hard it drowned out the engine noise. Bridgewater shouted into the intercom, "Hold formation, hold it." The gunners returned fire, twin .50s rattling through the waist positions, the tail gunner screaming coordinates. The smell of gunpowder and hot metal filled the fuselage. Then came the sound. A single heavy impact, like a hammer against the hull. The plane lurched hard left. Slammed into the radio rack, pain flashing through her shoulder. Bridgewater's voice came through, clipped, professional. Right wing fuel tank hit, losing pressure. Her blood ran cold. That was it. That was the scenario, the nightmare she'd spent a year trying to stop. "Activate suppression," she shouted. But Bridgewater was already on it. A hiss filled the cabin as CO2 flooded the wing cavity. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then through the right window, saw the vapor stream slow, then stop entirely. No fire. No flame. Just smoke dissipating into nothingness. Bridgewater exhaled hard. Tank sealed, temperature stable. He looked back at her with wide eyes. "Your system just saved our lives." She couldn't answer. Her throat tightened, her mind flashing back to her brother's final frames. And now, for the first time, she saw what it looked like when the fire didn't come. But the danger wasn't over. The impact had cracked part of the wing's internal structure. The outboard section now bent upward, vibrating under stress. Bridgewater eased back on the throttles for engines 3 and 4, trying to reduce torque. The plane dropped altitude, 24,000–23,000, 22,000 feet. "Stay with formation," the navigator urged. "We can't," Bridgewater said. "If that wing snaps, we're done." They fell behind. And in that moment of separation, 2 FW-190s pounced like wolves. Heard the cannon fire before she saw them, thudding, hollow explosions hitting the fuselage. The waist gunners fired back, tracers streaking across the gray sky. A Me-109 rolled through their field of fire, trailing black smoke before vanishing below. But another came in closing fast, guns flashing. A 20 round ripped through the fuselage 3 feet from its head, punching a hole through both walls. The supersonic crack was deafening. Shrapnel rained through the compartment. Something hot sliced across her left arm, a sharp, burning line that made her drop her pencil. She looked down, blood. Not serious but real. And for the first time, she understood what fear felt like in 3 dimensions. Bridgewater yelled, "Hang on," and dove the bomber toward lower altitude. The damaged wing creaked, metal straining, bolts groaning. If it gave way, they'd tear apart before they could even think of bailing out. The sky blurred. Grabbed the radio frame, knuckles white, praying to every god she'd ever ignored. Then out of nowhere, salvation roared in from the west. A P-47 Thunderbolt diving hard, its 8.50 calibers blazing. The German fighter chasing them exploded into flame and vanished into the clouds. The P-47 pulled up, wagged its wings, and stayed with them, a silent guardian escorting a crippled friend home. They crossed the English coast at 8,000 feet, limping but alive. Bridgewater's hands were steady on the controls. He called in an emergency, landing at the nearest field. The descent was slow, careful, every man holding his breath. When the wheels finally hit the runway, the sound was the most beautiful thing had ever heard. The aircraft rolled to a stop. Engines wound down. Then silence. She sat still for a full minute, her heart racing, her arm throbbing. When she finally climbed out, the cold air hit her like a baptism. She turned and looked at the wing, torn, dented, leaking frost from the CO2 system. But intact. Bridgewater joined her, removing his leather helmet, his hair soaked with sweat. "Your system saved us today," he said quietly. "That hit should lit the sky." Nodded, voice too small for words. She spent a year proving equations. Now she'd proven humanity. That night she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw fire, the kind that didn't come. Her arm throbbed under its bandage, but she didn't mind. It was a mark of belonging. She finally understood what it cost the crews she was fighting for. And she also understood something darker. It wasn't just the Germans they were fighting. It was the weight of complacency, of systems that refused to change, even when men died waiting for permission. She wrote in her journal before dawn, "The enemy is not always across the channel. Sometimes he sits behind a desk. Sometimes he writes unacceptable on a form. And sometimes that word kills more than bullets ever could." From that day forward changed. She became relentless. When Material Command suggested that older B-17F models weren't worth upgrading, that they were too close to retirement to justify the cost, she exploded. "Every crew deserves the same chance to live," she snapped. "Tell me which pilot's life is worth less than another's." No one argued after that. By April 1944, all new B-17G models rolled off assembly lines with her system built in. And the older bombers, the tired ones, the ones patched with memories, were being upgraded in the field. She traveled from base to base, teaching installation crews, inspecting damage, listening to pilots' stories. They called her the woman who made bombers bleed slower. She didn't mind. Every time a crew landed a burning aircraft that didn't explode, someone sent her a letter. Sometimes just one line. "Your fuel tank saved us." Those were the only words she ever needed. But war has a way of reminding you that progress always costs something. In May 1944, one of the modified bombers suffered a fire in flight, not from combat, but from an electrical short in the wing. The suppression system activated automatically, flooding the compartment with CO2. The fire died in seconds. But so did the oxygen. The crew barely made it down in time. It wasn't a flaw in design, it was a gap in understanding. Investigated the incident herself. Her conclusion was simple. The system had done its job, but the men hadn't known how to react to it. She rewrote the manuals, added 2 hours of training for every new crew. Because saving lives wasn't just about inventing systems, it was about teaching others how to trust them. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The largest armada in history moved toward Normandy. And in the skies above them, 723 B-17s. Of those, 689 carried system. The Luftwaffe threw everything they had left. Flak filled the sky. Bombers burned. But fewer than ever before. Only 3 were lost to fuel fires that day. Statistically, without the modification, there should have been 42. That was 290 lives saved in one day. Watch from a base in southern England as waves of bombers returned through the dusk, battered, smoking, but alive. Everyone that landed felt like an answered prayer. As she stood there in the fading light, someone asked her quietly, "Do you ever think your brother sees this?" She smiled faintly, eyes on the horizon. "I think he's been flying with us the whole time." That night, as engines cooled and crews slept, wrote the final line in her logbook for the day. Sometimes, victory isn't about destroying the enemy. Sometimes it's about saving those who fight. And somewhere across the channel, under the same moon that had watched her brother die, 1,000 bombers flew on, their wings heavier by 847 pounds, their crews lighter by the weight of fear. The war was turning, but peace still felt 1,000 miles away. From the outside, it looked like victory. From the inside, it sounded like engines that never slept. Stood on a windswept airfield in southern England, the morning after D-Day. The ground crews were already at work, replacing bullet-pocked panels, cleaning the blood from gunner stations, patching wings that had taken cannon fire and survived. Her system had done its job. And for the first time, she didn't know how to feel about that. Because the bombers she had made almost untouchable were now flying deeper, longer, harder. Each one that lived meant another mission tomorrow. Each miracle of survival became a reason to risk more lives. The paradox sat heavy on her chest. She stared across the tarmac where a line of B-17s gleamed in the gray dawn, silver giants preparing to take off again. They looked indestructible. But she knew better. That afternoon, she was summoned to the divisional headquarters, a temporary office in a manor house that smelled of damp carpet and tobacco. Major General May waited behind a cluttered desk, cigarette burning down between his fingers. He didn't bother with greetings. "Congratulations, your numbers are remarkable." She nodded, uncertain. Fuel fire losses down 63%, combat effectiveness up nearly 20%. Command wants your final production recommendations by Monday. She should have felt pride. Instead, she heard herself asking, "And how many more sorties because of it?" May frowned. "As many as it takes. You gave us endurance. We'd be fools not to use it." The sentence landed like a slap. Endurance, not safety, not mercy. Endurance. He stubbed out his cigarette, already turning back to the next folder. "You should be proud, miss. You made a weapon system that refuses to die." Outside, she stood motionless under the cold sunlight, hearing those words repeat in her head. A weapon system that refuses to die. Was that what her brother would have wanted? July 1944. Her orders sent her home. United Aircraft needed her for new programs, jet engines, pressurized fuel systems, guidance prototypes. The war was moving forward, and so was she. The crossing back to America was quiet this time. No submarine alarms, no blackout drills. Just the hollow ache of distance. She stood on the ship's deck at night, the Atlantic rolling black beneath her, the stars endless overhead. 8 months earlier, she'd sailed east carrying grief and fury. Now she was sailing west carrying results. Between the two, thousands of men had lived. And yet the sea still sounded the same, infinite, indifferent. When the Statue of Liberty appeared through morning mist, she realized she hadn't wept once on the voyage. Maybe she'd run out of tears, or maybe she'd traded them for resolve. Back in Hartford, the factory gates looked smaller than she remembered. The posters still promised victory, the newspapers still printed maps of Europe, but to the world felt quieter, as if the noise of combat still echoed inside her ears. Her office was just as she'd left it. Blueprints on the wall. A single telegram folded in the top drawer. The one that had started everything. She opened it once, read the first line, "The War Department regrets to inform you," and folded it again. Then she set it back where it belonged. Not a wound now, a reminder. Within weeks she was buried in new assignments. The Air Force wanted her expertise on the upcoming B-29 program, longer range, higher altitude, greater payload. Different aircraft, same problem, fuel and fire. But the further she went up the ladder, the more she noticed what success cost. Meetings became colder. Men spoke of efficiency metrics and loss replacement curves, never of people. Each innovation became a line on a chart, not a heartbeat. One afternoon, a younger engineer showed her a performance graph comparing sortie numbers before and after her modification. He was smiling. "Your system increased mission sustainability by 19%, he said proudly. She stared at the line rising across the paper. Each upward tick a mission flown deeper into Germany. More bombs dropped, more cities burning. "Tell me," she asked quietly, "how many of those targets had civilians below them?" The young man froze. I don't have that data, ma'am." "Neither do I," she said. "That's the problem." That night she walked through the factory alone. The production floor glowed under fluorescent lights, echoing with the metallic heartbeat of machinery. Men welded wing spars. Women in coveralls sealed fuel tanks with brushes dipped in black adhesive. Every sound was familiar, comforting once. Now it felt like the ticking of a giant clock, counting down the moments until someone else's tragedy. She stopped beside a half-finished B-24 wing section. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished aluminum, older than she remembered, eyes darker, jaw. She whispered, "We keep making them better so they can keep dying slower." A voice came from behind her. "You did what had to be done." It was Robert, her husband. He'd come quietly, holding 2 cups of coffee. "They needed you," he said softly. "Without you, thousands more would be dead." She took the cup, stared into the dark liquid. "And with me, thousands more can kill longer." He hesitated. "You can't carry both sides of that." "Maybe not," she said, "but someone should at least remember they exist." August 1944. General's letter arrived, official, perfumed with politics. It thanked her for technical contributions to bomber protection and exemplary service to national defense. A single page summarizing 9 months of defiance, loss, and sleepless nights. She read it once, then filed it away. Recognition meant nothing if the lesson behind it was forgotten. Because buried under the success was a truth no one wanted to print. Innovation had saved lives, yes, but it had also made killing sustainable. Every time the brass said improved survivability, she heard extended campaign. And she began to wonder whether survival by war could ever equal peace. By autumn, the front lines pushed east. Rumors whispered through the factory, Germany on the verge of collapse. But production didn't slow. In fact, it accelerated. The Air Force wanted replacements for losses that hadn't even happened yet. Attended meeting after meeting, drafting protocols, solving failures before they existed. Her hands wrote formulas. Her mind replayed the faces of men she'd met at Marco Bobby, wondering which of them still breathed. Then one morning, a small parcel arrived without a return address. Inside was a square of rubber, blackened and torn, mounted on a wooden board with a brass plate. This saved 10 lives. June 24, 1943. She traced the inscription with her fingertip. He'd kept his promise. The tears came quietly this time, slipping down her cheeks as she set the plaque on her desk. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel proud not of the system, but of the people it had protected. Winter came early in 1944. Snow drifted across the hangar roofs, muting the clatter of tools and the bark of supervisors. The war was nearly won. But for victory carried an echo, the sound of typewriters stamping requisitions for the next design, the next threat, the next war. She began teaching a new group of engineers, young, eager, unscarred. She made them start every project with a single question written in bold across the chalkboard. Who does this protect? Most thought it was a slogan. She knew it was a lifeline. She taught them the story of an 847-pound penalty that saved thousands. She told them how data had once been measured in human lives. And she made them promise never to forget the difference between solving a problem and preventing a tragedy. One evening she stayed late, finishing a report. Outside, the factory yard was silent except for distant thunder. She opened her notebook, the same one she'd carried across the Atlantic, and added a final entry. Engineering is not victory. It is responsibility carried in metal and fuel and blood. The world calls it progress. I call it the privilege to prevent. She closed the book, turned off the lamp, and walked out into the snow. Months later, when Germany finally surrendered, the news rippled through the factory in waves of cheers and tears. Men threw their caps in the air. Women hugged each other, grease-stained hands trembling with relief. Stood at her office window, listening to the celebration, unable to join. For her, the war had ended a long time ago, somewhere above Bremen, when a wounded bomber came home instead of burning. Everything since had been aftermath. Robert found her there and rested a hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said softly. She nodded. "Then maybe now we can start fixing what peace forgot." He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't need to. In the months that followed, production lines slowed, then stopped. The hangars emptied. Bombers that had survived hundreds of missions were towed into storage yards, stripped for parts, or sold for scrap. Visited one of those yards in March 1945. Row after row of aircraft sat silent under a gray sky, wings torn open, aluminum skin dull and lifeless. She walked among them like a mourner in a field of gravestones. On one fuselage she recognized a faint name painted near the nose, Lady Liberty. The paint was peeling, the letters almost gone. She placed her hand on the metal and whispered, "You did your part." Nearby, a workman with a cutting torch paused and nodded respectfully before resuming his task. Sparks flew, bright and brief, like tracer rounds disappearing into the air. That night back home, wrote a letter she would never send. It began simply, "Dear David, they finally stopped fighting. I kept my promise, you weren't forgotten." She folded it carefully and slipped it into the same drawer as the telegram. The paper rested there, grief and redemption side by side. Then she turned off the light. For the first time in 2 years, she slept through the night. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And sometimes, the greatest victories aren't won in the air or on the battlefield, but in the quiet persistence of a single soul who refuses to accept that tragedy is inevitable. Never called herself a hero, but thousands of flew home because she chose to be stubborn instead of silent. The guns had gone silent. Europe lay in ruins, and the sky, once black with wings, was suddenly empty. Factories shut down, barracks emptied, medals gleamed in drawers. The war had ended, but for peace felt stranger than any battle. She woke up the first morning after the armistice to birdsong. No sirens, no engines, no coded briefings before dawn. Just sunlight cutting through the blinds, and the realization that the world had survived what it shouldn't have. And she didn't know what to do with that silence. In the weeks that followed, she helped decommission the plants she'd built her life around. Lines that had once produced wing sections and fuel tanks were repurposed for farm machinery. The hangar that had echoed with the clang of rivets now smelled of paint and dust. She walked the floor one last time, trailing her hand along the same steel tables where she'd fought so many battles with metal and math. Every dent, every scratch carried ghosts. When a supervisor asked if she wanted to keep her old desk plate, she smiled faintly. "Let it stay," she said. "Maybe the next engineer will remember what it meant." But she knew the next engineer wouldn't. The world was already rushing toward something new. By 1946, the newspapers had replaced war maps with advertisements for refrigerators and cars. People wanted color again. Laughter. Normal. Tried. She gardened. She cooked dinners with Robert. They went to the cinema once a week. But every time an engine roared overhead, she looked up, and for a split second her mind was back over Bremen. Robert noticed it. He'd reach for her hand in the dark theater, the flicker of newsreels reflecting off his glasses. "You're still there, aren't you?" he'd whisper. She never answered. Because he was right. That autumn she received an invitation embossed, official, signed by General himself. The War Department was holding a ceremony in Washington to honor civilian engineers whose contributions had directly advanced Allied victory. She almost didn't go. But Robert insisted. "You faced worse than a ballroom," he said with a smile. So she went. The hall was glittering, chandeliers, uniforms, applause that echoed too long. She stood beside men who designed engines, radar, code machines. When they called her name, Doctor, for the self-sealing fuel containment system, the crowd applauded politely. She accepted the medal, shook hands, smiled for photographs. But later that night, she found herself in a quiet corridor outside the banquet room, the sound of laughter fading behind her. She looked at the medal in her palm, heavy, cold, shining like a piece of shrapnel. It didn't feel like honor. It felt like memory forged in metal. A man approached, tall, gray-haired, uniform neat as precision. It was General May. He hadn't changed much, except for the tiredness behind his eyes. "Hell of a ceremony," he said, "but none of them know what any of it really cost." Nodded. "I suppose that's the point." He studied her for a long moment. "Do you regret it?" She thought about the question, really thought. Finally she said, "No, I regret that it was needed." May gave a short nod, fair answer. Then he added almost gently, "You saved lives, don't ever apologize for that." He walked away before she could reply. And in the echo of his footsteps, she realized how few people ever truly understood what it meant to save a life, or to live with the weight of the ones you couldn't. In the following years, became a consultant for civil aviation. She worked on fuel systems for passenger planes, safe, efficient, quiet. Every time a new model took its first flight, she watched from the ground, heart steady but eyes wet. No flak, no fighters, just sky. She helped design the first generation of pressurized cabin tanks, technology that traced directly back to her wartime work. For the first time, her inventions weren't about surviving fire. They were about preventing it altogether. And yet sometimes, when she'd be in a hangar inspecting a new plane, a pilot would recognize her name and say softly, "You're the who fixed the B-17s, right?" She'd smile small and quiet. "I just gave them a better chance to come home." In 1948, she received a letter from Europe. It came from an RAF pilot she'd once met during testing. Inside was a photograph, a reunion of surviving bomber crews. Men grinning under a banner that read, "Still flying." On the back of the photo, scrawled in blue ink, were 5 words. "Because of you, we did." She framed it and kept it on her office wall. Not the medal, not the award. Just that picture, ordinary men alive when they shouldn't have been. But peace doesn't erase war. It only hides it under the noise of normal life. One rainy evening in 1951, stopped at a roadside diner after a conference. At a corner booth, a young man in uniform sat hunched over his coffee. Air Force wings on his chest, new design, new generation. She asked if she could join him. He looked up surprised, then smiled politely. "Of course, ma'am." They talked about weather training, the new jet engines. He told her he was heading overseas soon, Korea. And when she asked what he flew, he said, "B-29, they say it's indestructible." Something in her chest tightened. She looked at the boy. He couldn't have been more than 20. So young he probably didn't know what burning aluminum smelled like. "Be careful," she said softly. "Nothing we build is indestructible. Only the reasons we fly can be." He didn't quite understand, but he nodded anyway. When she left, she watched his reflection in the diner window. Another child walking into the next war built on the lessons of the last. The years blurred. Technology leapt forward, jets, missiles, computers. Adapted, taught, advised. But something inside her stayed, anchored to 1943. She started lecturing at universities, not about equations but about ethics. Her course title was simple, Engineering in the Shadow of War. She'd begin each semester the same way. "You will invent things that outlive you. Make sure they deserve to." Students adored her, not because she told them how to design, but because she told them why. In 1956, a student asked if she ever thought humanity would stop using engineers to wage war. Smiled sadly. "Probably not, but maybe one day we'll remember that building to protect is harder and braver than building to destroy." After class, she walked across campus under autumn trees, thinking of how far she'd come from the girl standing in a smoke-filled hangar, begging to be heard. Back then, the world had measured worth in tonnage and rank. Now, her worth lived quietly in every passenger who crossed an ocean safely, every pilot who landed without fear of flame. Time moved differently after that. Her hair silvered. Robert's laughter softened into memory after he passed in '59. She stayed in the same small house, tended the same garden, lived surrounded by the hum of peace she'd once only dreamed of. Sometimes, on summer evenings, she'd sit on the porch and listen to the distant drone of a prop plane. And for a heartbeat, she'd see it, the shape of a B-17 against the setting sun, steady, unafraid. In 1961, a reporter found her. He wanted to write about the woman who made bombers safer. He brought a photographer, a tape recorder, questions rehearsed to sound profound. But she refused the interview. She poured him tea instead and said quietly, "If I tell you my story, you'll make it about victory. It was never about that." He blinked, confused. Then what was it about? She smiled. "About not giving up on humanity, even when humanity seems to have given up on itself." He left with no article, just a notebook full of half-answers and a photograph of her standing in sunlight, her expression unreadable, the kind of photograph that says more than history books ever could. Years later, when the world raced toward the stars, NASA engineers studying spacecraft fuel systems stumbled upon old Air Force documents. One of them noticed her name on a patent file, dated 1943. The next shuttle prototypes used modified sealing technology based on her early work. Without fanfare had reached space. Not through ambition, but through persistence, through the idea that safety is the truest form of courage. In the twilight of her life, she kept a small wooden box on her desk. Inside were only three things: the telegram, the photo of the bomber cruise, and the medal she'd once thought meaningless. Some nights she'd open the box, look at each piece, and whisper to the dark, "Maybe this is what redemption looks like, not glory, just the chance to keep others from burning." On her final birthday, she invited a few of her former students to dinner. They brought flowers, laughter, stories. When they toasted her, she said softly, "Promise me something. When the next war comes, and it will, don't let anyone call destruction inevitable. We made machines to kill. We can make them to protect. That's your inheritance." And the room fell silent, not out of sadness but respect. She passed away quietly the next spring. No headlines, no parades, just a short obituary in the Hartford Courant. Doctor, aviation engineer, and wartime innovator passed peacefully at home. She was 67. Her work continues to protect aviators worldwide. The world moved on, as it always does. But above the clouds, in every aircraft that crosses the sky safely, a piece of her defiance still hums through the metal, whispering, "Come back. Just come back." Sometimes, history remembers the generals and the battles. But the truest victories belong to those who never saw the front lines, to the minds that turned pain into progress, and the hearts that made survival an act of compassion. Didn't change the war. She changed what war could no longer destroy. The belief that one quiet voice can still save lives. The decades passed quietly, as they often do for those who never asked to be remembered. Time eroded names, folded history into footnotes, and replaced faces with statistics. Became one of those quiet names, one that engineers might stumble across in old archives just long enough to murmur, "I've heard of her," before moving on to newer heroes. The world she left behind had moved on faster, louder, higher. Jets ruled the sky now. Satellites circled the earth. And the next generation of engineers built not to survive war, but to conquer space. Or so they thought. It was 1984 when her name resurfaced. A young aerospace engineer named Dr. Cole was deep in research for NASA's high-altitude flight safety project. She was brilliant, 32, ambitious, unyielding. The kind of woman who rarely slept, who solved equations like puzzles and carried a quiet defiance in her walk. One night, while combing through Air Force documents, found a file stamped "Classified 1943." Inside were test reports, fuel system diagrams, and a signature she didn't recognize. Dr. M. She skimmed the first few pages: chemical compositions, CO2 pressure ratios, ballistic impact data. Then she found something different: handwritten notes in the margins. Small, precise letters in faded pencil. "The weight of safety is lighter than the cost of regret." Stopped reading. She sat there in silence, staring at those words, feeling something she couldn't name. She wasn't sure if it was admiration or shame that she'd never heard of the woman who wrote them. 2 weeks later, she requested the full archive. The clerk shrugged. "Half those records are missing. Rest probably went a scrap when the base closed." But didn't stop there. She followed every trail: Wright Field, archives, university libraries. Piece by piece, she built a mosaic of a life nearly forgotten. A female engineer in the 1940s. A rejected design turned into an innovation. A system that changed the survival rate of bomber crews by 60%. And yet no biography, no recognition, no textbooks. It didn't make sense. Until she found a photograph, grainy, black and white. A woman in a grease-stained uniform, standing beside a damaged B-17. No smile, just resolve. On the back, Airfield 1943. Stared at it for a long time. She saw something familiar, not the face but the look in the eyes. That quiet kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself. She whispered, "You fought the same war I'm fighting, just in a different century." In 1985, she proposed a presentation for the National Aerospace Safety Symposium. Forgotten architect of survival, the fuel integrity system and its modern legacy. The panel almost did. One reviewer wrote, "Historical curiosity, limited technical relevance," but fought for it and won one slot on the final day, right before closing remarks. Her peers expected a dry historical talk. They got something else entirely. The lights dimmed. A slide appeared, a black and white photo of a B-17, riddled with holes, landing on one wheel. Then another, the damaged fuel tank, the handwritten notes. His voice was steady, quiet, measured like a story more than a lecture. She was told it couldn't be done, she began. She was told the design was too heavy, too costly, too late. But didn't build for permission. She built for the men who never came home. The audience leaned in. Showed them data from wartime reports, the drop in fuel fire fatalities, the rise in mission survival rates. She read from his own letters. Every engineer holds lives in their hands. The numbers we calculate are written in blood. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Not the polite kind of silence, the heavy kind that feels like understanding. Someone asked from the back, "Why haven't we ever heard of her?" Looked down at the lectern, then up again. Because history prefers its heroes loud, and she was. After the talk, older engineers came to her quietly, one by one. They'd flown B-17s in the war, or had fathers who did. One man with trembling hands told her, "My dad made it back from Bremen, maybe because of her." That night, walked out into the parking lot and sat in her car for a long time before starting the engine. It was raining. The windshield blurred, and through the streaks she saw runway lights at the nearby test field glowing faintly through the dark, like stars reflected on wet asphalt. She whispered, "You're still saving people even now." The months that followed changed everything. NASA added system to its safety legacy curriculum, a required case study for aerospace engineers. The requested access to research for a small exhibit. Hidden hands of aviation. And when they unveiled it, there it was. Photo beside a battered fuel tank section, and her handwritten quote in gold script. "Sometimes safety isn't progress, it's defiance." Visitors stopped to read it, moved in ways they didn't expect. Some cried. Some took photos. And somewhere unseen, it felt as if history itself had finally exhaled. But for the story didn't end there. She wanted more than remembrance. She wanted continuation. She began working on a new project, the Containment Initiative, a modern adaptation of sealing technology for reusable spacecraft fuel systems. The same principle: prevent ignition, isolate breach, preserve life. Different century, same purpose. Her colleagues called it poetic. She called it necessary. Every time they hit a roadblock, funding, design failure, bureaucracy, she'd look at its photograph on her desk and mutter, "You didn't quit, neither will I." In 1989, the Challenger disaster still haunted everyone at NASA. His team argued that safety needed a voice again, one loud enough this time to be heard. The system, too, was approved for prototype testing. When it succeeded, preventing a simulated rupture during launch vibration trials didn't cheer. She just smiled softly, the same way had after that first mission came home. A journalist later asked her why she named it after a forgotten engineer. She said, because remembering her reminds us why we build. She made bombers survive war. Maybe her legacy can make us survive ourselves. The years rolled on. The Cold War thawed. Space became routine. And somewhere in orbit, systems bearing the name quietly did their job, unnoticed, uncelebrated, but working exactly as intended. That was the kind of immortality would have wanted. Silent, functional, human. In 2004, on the 60th anniversary of D-Day, a ceremony was held at the Air and Space Museum. They restored a B-17G to full display, silver and proud, gleaming under soft lights. Beneath its wing, a new plaque read, "Dedicated to Dr. 1911-1978, whose courage and innovation saved countless during World War II. Her work continues to protect aviators to this day." Stood in the crowd, now older, gray at the temples. As she watched the ceremony, she realized something profound. This fight had never really been about war. It had been about accountability. The courage to care when it wasn't convenient. That, she thought, is what makes a legacy. Later that night, long after the crowd had gone, she stayed behind in the dim hall. The only light came from the soft glow on the aircraft's fuselage. She reached up and placed her hand on the cold aluminum skin, whispering, "You made sure they came home. And now I think you've finally come home too." A guard passing by stopped for a moment, watching her. He didn't interrupt. Some moments don't need words. Years later, in 2020, as humanity prepared for interplanetary travel, engineers again studied old designs for redundancy and fuel safety. And deep in a digital archive labeled Historical Systems, 1940 present, they found her name once more. Her work had survived 7 decades, 10 wars, and every kind of progress. And still, her handwriting, that same looping script, appeared beside the equations. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The words became a motto engraved on the side of every new NASA safety module. Not for publicity, for remembrance. Maybe that's the truest form of immortality, not statues or medals, but influence written in steel and silence. Because every engineer, somewhere, someday, will ask themselves the question she first wrote in her notebook. Who does this protect? And when they do, even without knowing it, they'll be answering to her. Story isn't just about invention. It's about conscience, the kind that survives generations. The kind that reminds us that progress without empathy is just another weapon. In the end, she didn't change the world by being the loudest voice in the room. She changed it by refusing to let fear, or politics, or pride dictate what was possible. And somewhere, in the hum of every aircraft that crosses the sky safely, in the silence after every successful landing, her spirit still whispers through the metal, steady, unseen, eternal. Come back, just come back. Time doesn't remember softly. It replaces. It refines. It forgets what it can't categorize. But every now and then, a single name breaks through the static, reminding the future that progress without empathy is just a prettier form of destruction. His name had done that. Not loudly. Not all at once. But in quiet ripples that reached farther than she ever lived to see. By 2025, her legacy had left the hangar. It lived inside fields she'd never imagined. Medicine, artificial intelligence, renewable energy. Because her principles, resilience, containment, compassion through design, had aviation. They'd become philosophy. At MIT, the Initiative for Ethical Engineering began as a simple research group. It was founded by none other than Dr. Cole's daughter, Cole, herself, a systems engineer turned educator. She had grown up hearing the story of the woman who saved lives by refusing to be silenced. For wasn't history. She was conscience. In her first lecture, told her students, "We teach Newton for physics, Turing for computation, Curie for discovery. But for conscience, for courage that asks should we, not just can we teach." On the projector behind her was a photo, the same black and white image her mother had once found in a forgotten folder. Standing beside a bomber wing, eyes fixed forward. The room was silent, not because of reverence, but because of recognition. That look in his eyes felt familiar to every young engineer who'd ever felt invisible for wanting to make things safer instead of faster. The initiative's motto hung on the wall of the lab in brushed steel letters. Build for life, not legacy. It became a mantra, one recited at every design review, every project defense. Because what they built was just code, or circuits, or machines. It was accountability. One student, Malik, was designing AI systems for autonomous vehicles. He had studied all the logic models, all the fail-safes, but something still troubled him. During a seminar discussion, he asked, "What happens if the safest choice means one person dies instead of two? If it's between numbers, how do we choose?" Didn't answer immediately. She walked to the board and wrote 5 words in big, looping script. "The numbers are human lives." Then she told them story, the fuel tanks, the bureaucracy, the cost of delay. She described how one engineer refused to see safety as a spreadsheet. When she finished, the room felt heavier. Looked at the words again and whispered, "So it's never math, it's morality." Smiled, "Exactly, and morality has no autopilot." Outside academia, the philosophy began shaping corporate ethics too. In 2028, a major tech company invited to consult after one of their AI models caused real-world harm. An autonomous drone had misinterpreted civilian heat signatures. The board expected damage control. They got truth. Stood before them, one woman in a room full of executives, and said, "You're asking how to fix a malfunction. I'm asking how you built something that forgot its purpose." She quoted again, "The enemy isn't always across the field. Sometimes he sits behind a desk." The room went silent. And slowly something shifted, not in code but in culture. They didn't patch software that day. They rewrote policy. In the years that followed, its ideas became more than case studies. They became a movement. Engineering became a term used in universities and companies alike to describe design born from moral clarity, not market demand. It wasn't about slowing progress. It was about giving it purpose. And somewhere, deep in that shift, her spirit lived, in the hands of people who believed technology should heal as much as it helped. In 2030, one was invited to speak at the Global Ethics Forum in Geneva. Her topic, the invention of conscience. She began with a story most of the audience had never heard. A young engineer in 1943, dismissed by superiors. An invention deemed too heavy to matter. An airfield in England, where 10 men lived because she refused to give up. Then said, "Didn't just save. She saved us from forgetting what we build for." She paused. Today, we build things couldn't have imagined, quantum systems, AI, machines that think. But the question she left us still decides what kind of world we live in. Who does this protect? When she finished, the audience didn't clap right away. They just sat there silent, thoughtful, changed. A month later, a journalist wrote, "In an age of automation, ghost still haunts our machines, not to condemn, but to remind." Somewhere in the Arizona desert, a private space company was testing its first long-range crew module, the Odyssey Initiative. Among its engineers was a young woman named Grant, 26, head of safety systems. She kept a printout of quote tape to her monitor. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The night before the test flight, the project director suggested removing a redundant containment system to save weight. It was a small risk, he said. Statistically insignificant. Looked at the numbers. Then she looked at the quote. "No," she said quietly. "It stays." They argued for hours. She stood her ground. The system stayed. 2 weeks later, on re-entry, one of the main fuel couplings cracked under vibration. The containment system isolated it in seconds. No explosion. No lives lost. Afterward, when the director thanked her for trusting her instincts, only smiled. "It wasn't instinct," she said. "It was inheritance." By 2040, principles had spread beyond engineering altogether. Hospitals used her decision model for medical triage. Aid organizations used her philosophy for disaster response systems, prioritizing lives over logistics. Her legacy became the spine of modern human-centered design. Everywhere that technology met morality, her fingerprints appeared. Not as decoration, as direction. And yet her story, the woman herself, remained almost myth. Students read her quotes. Engineers referenced her methods. But few truly knew her. Until one day, a filmmaker named Heller decided to change that. Had been researching unsung women in wartime innovation. When she came across name in a digital archive, she became obsessed. The photographs, the reports, the silence around her. It was cinematic tragedy begging to be seen. She spent 2 years gathering letters, interviewing historians, even tracking down Cole's daughter. The result was a documentary called The Weight of Silence. The film opened with a single voiceover, soft, deliberate, haunting. She didn't fly the bombers. She made sure they came home. Then the image of that airfield, wind sweeping across the tarmac, and the slow echo of engines fatting into the distance. The film didn't dramatize life. It let her speak for herself, through diary excerpts, letters, and reenactments framed with restraint. When it premiered, audiences wept. Not because it was sad, but because it felt true. It wasn't a story about war. It was a story about one woman's refusal to let war define humanity. Ended the film with a voice that was, but could been. It said, "If we forget to ask who this protects, we'll keep inventing ways to destroy each other and calling it progress." That line became the new moral compass of a generation tired of unchecked innovation. In classrooms, in think tanks, in design labs, young inventors began writing it on their whiteboards like a quiet rebellion. Had become something larger than history. She had become a question, a mirror for every hand that ever built anything powerful enough to help or to harm. And maybe that was always her destiny. Not to be remembered as a hero, but as a conscience that refuses to die. One night, nearly a century after her first design sketch, a group of astronauts aboard a Mars transport vessel reviewed their systems. Each subsystem bore the stamp of its lineage: propulsion, navigation, life support. Under fuel containment, a small inscription appeared. Integrity Unit Mark VII. One astronaut, a young woman with dark hair and steady eyes, smiled. Her grandmother had worked at testing rubber for aircraft. She told her stories of a woman who wouldn't give up. She whispered into the ship's hum, "Thank you. Outside, the red planet shone faintly in the distance. And somewhere, perhaps, across the silent void, the echo of an old promise whispered back. Come back, just come back. Because that was always the point. Not victory, not invention, not even survival, but return. The act of bringing something or someone home. That was her masterpiece. That was her legacy. And long after her bones had turned to dust, her defiance still burned in circuits, seals, and souls, reminding humanity that dignity doesn't die when people forget your name. It lives on in the way they treat each other after you're gone. Sometimes progress is loud. Sometimes it's silent. And sometimes it's just one woman whispering through time. Do better than I did. And never let them tell you safety isn't worth the wait. There's a field in England, just outside the small village of. Most maps don't show it anymore. The hangars are gone. The runways are cracked and half swallowed by grass. But if you stand there long enough, you can still hear it. The faint echo of engines beneath the wind. Once, this was where the sky trembled with the weight of war. Once, this was where men climbed into silver machines and prayed to see another dawn. And once, this was where a woman stood, an engineer with oil on her hands and grief in her heart, watching her design take flight for the first time. 80 years later, another woman stands in the same place. Cole, granddaughter of. She's here to film a short segment for a documentary update. A piece called The Last Whisper of. The crew sets up behind her, drones, cameras, lights. But she asks them to wait. She wants a moment alone. The grass bends under a cold wind. The sky is gray, the kind of gray that feels old. Closes her eyes and imagines what this place once sounded like. The roar of takeoff, the shouted orders, the clang of wrenches. She imagines standing right where she stands now. Small, determined, staring at the sky with everything to lose. Her phone buzzes. A message from the producer. Need 3 minutes of reflection for closing. Keep it simple, emotional. Smiles. Simple, she thinks. What could be simple about a woman who changed the world by refusing to let it burn? She begins recording her own words, softly. Not reading a script. Just speaking into the wind. The way you talk to someone you'll never meet, but somehow understand completely. She didn't want fame, she says. She wanted accountability. In a world built on speed and pride, she built something humble, a second chance. Glances around the field, as if waiting for a response. There's only wind, but somehow it feels like listening. As the crew sets up, a historian walks over a man in his 60s, with a worn jacket and kind eyes. He tells her quietly, locals say on certain foggy mornings, you can still hear the old planes taking off. As if they never stopped. Smiles. Maybe they didn't. The historian nods. They called this field cursed once, too many deaths in training. But after the modification, not one bomber here ever caught fire again. Not one. He pauses. I suppose some ghosts earn their peace. Later that evening, the crew packs up. Stays behind. The sky has turned orange and soft. She walks the old runway alone. The asphalt cracked and faded beneath her shoes. At the far end, half buried in the dirt, she finds something. A bent piece of aluminum, no bigger than her hand. It's dull with age, but stamped faintly with numbers. B-17G, Section 41. She wipes the dust away. The metal catches the sunset just right. And for a heartbeat, it glows. Her voiceover continues in the background. The words that will become the final narration of the documentary. But they sound less like narration and more like confession. We build machines and call them progress. We build systems and call them safe. But somewhere deep down, we still need people brave enough to ask why. She pauses, her breath catching slightly. Asked why, and the answer she gave wasn't about metal or rubber or chemistry. It was about conscience, the simple belief that saving one life is never wasted effort. The camera drone rises slowly, pulling away, capturing standing in the vast emptiness, a single figure against the golden field. Back at our studio, weeks later, reviews the footage. The final edit feels incomplete. Beautiful, yes, but she wants something more. Something that bridges then and now. So she adds one last scene, unseen by the producers until release. A sequence without dialogue. A slow montage. Archival footage of B-17s limping home on one wing. Factory workers in coverall sealing fuel tanks by hand. A black and white photo of holding a wrench beside Lady Liberty. Then, a modern shot. Astronauts stepping onto a Mars capsule marked Integrity Unit, VII. And finally, the words that close the film. Sometimes, progress isn't about reaching farther. It's about returning safely. When the documentary premieres, critics call it haunting. Audiences call it healing. But the people who love it most are engineers. Because they recognize the truth behind every frame. That creation is a moral act. That every design, no matter how small, is a promise. Either to protect or to profit. And that promise, once made, outlives the maker. Months later, receives a letter. No return address, just a typewritten note. My grandfather flew with the 351st. He never talked about the war, but he always said one thing. Somebody made sure I came home. I think I finally know who he meant. There's a folded photograph inside. An old man in uniform, standing beside his grandson, both smiling. On the back, scrawled in faded ink, Lady Liberty, 1943. Sets it beside her computer monitor and whispers. She'd have liked that. Later that year, she travels to Washington, D.C. At the Air and Space Museum, there's a new addition to the exhibit. A small bronze statue, simple and unadorned. It doesn't show holding a wrench or blueprint. It shows her listening, one hand on the fuselage of a bomber, as if feeling the heartbeat of the machine she'd made safe. Beneath it, engraved words. She didn't seek glory. She sought decency. Visitors stop and read in silence. Some smile. Some cry. A few engineers take photos and whisper to one another. She's the reason we're still here. That night the museum closes. The lights dim. And in the quiet hall, the bomber looms above, polished, still eternal. Outside, the city hums with the future. Cars without drivers, drones without pilots, machines making decisions faster than hearts can beat. But inside, the air feels sacred. A cathedral built not of faith, but of memory. And maybe, if you listen closely, you can still hear her voice. Not from the speakers, but from somewhere between the rivets and the silence. Don't forget why you build. Years pass. The world changes again. Wars shift from sky to circuit. The tools are different, but the question remains the same. Who does this protect? And each time it's asked, somewhere unseen, answers. In 2061, a century after her first test flight, the initiative launches its next generation. A solar-powered humanitarian drone designed to deliver medical aid in conflict zones. It's unarmed, unmanned, unafraid. They call it Project Lady Liberty. During the launch broadcast, granddaughter, now an engineer herself, reads a single line from his journal. "We can build to kill, or we can build to bring home. The choice is always ours." The drone lifts into the sky, its wings glinting gold under the sun. And for a moment, the airfield that seems alive again. Engines hum, grass bends, and history, just for an instant, breathes. In the final moments of the film, the voiceover returns to where it all began. A woman watching the sky, holding on to a dream that the world once called impossible. The screen fades from modern color to sepia, then to black and white, and stands there again in the wind. Her face half-shadowed, her eyes bright with purpose. The narrator's voice, steady, warm, almost like hers, whispers. She never flew a mission. She never dropped a bomb. But every plane that made it home carried her name in its silence. Every safe landing was her signature. Every dawn that followed destruction was her defiance. A long pause. Then the final line, spoken softly, like a prayer, like a promise. "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is make sure others get to live." The screen fades to black. Then white text. Eleanor WNSLOW, 1911-1978. Engineer, innovator, humanitarian. Her legacy lives in every life preserved by courage and conscience. Music swells, gentle piano, then strings. Not triumphant, not mournful. Just steady. The credits roll over footage of clouds drifting above an endless sky. The kind of sky she once helped make survivable. And the final sound. After all the names fade, after the last note fades into silence, is the faint, familiar hum of engines, growing softer, until it disappears into the wind. Because her story was never just about invention. It was about return. The return of hope, of humanity, of home. And in that return, found eternity.